For much of its history, Latin America has experienced chronic poverty and massive inequality. Of course, throughout the colonial era, this was very much the intended policy, as the whole point of the colonies was to provide resources and benefits to the ruling elite. Nonetheless, despite 200 years of independence and rhetorical claims that make the eradication of poverty a priority, the problem remains far from solved. So where are the poorest places in the region? Where are its most unequal? And what does that mean? Join me for a brief look at the poverty and inequality that plague Latin America. Now, whenever we talk about poverty, or inequality for that matter, it's important to understand how these things are measured, because they're not easy to estimate. For one thing, prices differ from place to place, even within the same country. So do government services and cultural norms of reciprocity, not to mention living conditions in general. In the countryside, for instance, plumbing might not be as necessary as it would be in the city, and so on. Inequality is even harder, as income alone cannot capture social capital of various kinds. Still, there are two internationally accepted measures for these things, and that is what we will use. For poverty, the international line used is when individuals live on less than $1.90 a day. Currently, the poorest country in the world is South Sudan, where 85.6% of its people live on or below the threshold. For inequality, the most common measure is the Gini coefficient. This is a distribution where 0 means that all people have the same amount of income or wealth, and 100 is where a single person has all the income in a given place. According to the World Bank, as of 2018, the most equal place in the world was Slovenia with a figure of 24.6, while the most unequal was South Africa with a comparable number of 63. To give you more specific numbers, in 2017, the top richest 3,500 individuals in South Africa held 15% of all wealth in that country, more than the bottom 90% combined. The differences across the income distribution are massive. So what about Latin America? The region made huge strides between 2000 and 2015 as the commodity boom boosted many of the Latin American economies, although not all equally, of course. Unfortunately, this movement stalled after 2015, and then COVID happened. We do not know the full impact of the pandemic yet, but the region has been the worst hit in the world, and in places where we do have numbers, like in Mexico, we have seen significant reversals. So take into account that any of the figures I'm about to show you are bound to be worse, even much worse in some cases. Also, I should note that while most of this is based on World Bank data, the first three numbers come from local NGOs, as the governments of those countries, not surprisingly, either hide entirely or play down their levels of extreme poverty. As of right now, the 10 countries with the most people living in extreme poverty in Latin America are Venezuela, followed by Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, Honduras, Belize, Bolivia, Guatemala, Colombia, Brazil, and Ecuador. The numbers are staggering. According to UCAB, a university in Venezuela, 67% of all Venezuelans live in extreme poverty. Although even in the poorest country in Latin America, poverty is concentrated in rural areas. The state of Amazonas, for instance, known for its natural beauty and little population, has a staggering 71% living under extreme poverty, while the Caracas district clocks in at 57%, and the neighboring Miranda state at 59%. I explained the causes for Venezuela's plight elsewhere, but basically the reason for Venezuela's poverty today has been a combination of really bad economic policy, particularly that of printing money that sent inflation through the roof, the collapse of state capacity, and a dependency on oil, which made its economy particularly susceptible to price swings. Cubans are just below the Venezuelans, with 64% of their population in extreme poverty. This number comes from a Cuban NGO survey, Observatorio Cubano de Conflictos, as official Cuban institutions do not try to measure poverty in the country. The reasons for the Cuban plight are similar to the Venezuelans: terrible economic policy and economic dependency, although on tourism, not oil. The other big difference is that Cuba has faced an embargo from the US for decades, not to mention that Cuba's state is not nearly as weak as Venezuela's, and thus provide, at least in theory, massive subsidies to help its population. Of course, this is hard to do without hard currency, and as COVID has battered Cuba, this has been even more theoretical than usual in the last few years. The next poorest country is Nicaragua, According to another NGO, the Nicaraguan Foundation Funides, between 28 and 32% of all Nicaraguans are living in extreme poverty. The reasons stem all the way back to colonial times, but more recently, its 1980 Civil War, terrible economic policy, and the onslaught of COVID have made things worse. Honduras, whose rate according to the World Bank is around 17.9%, has also had massive poverty since colonial times, and its major export of bananas in the 19th century never provided broad prosperity. Its main reason for poverty today, however, is that Honduras has always had a weak state that cannot provide adequate infrastructure, let alone comprehensive plans to lift regions out of poverty. Thus, poor people are particularly concentrated in the Cordillera del Sur, its southern mountain range. The increasing gang presence and political corruption don't help either. Meanwhile, Belize, which has an equal rate of people living in extreme poverty to Honduras, according to the World Bank, has also suffered from a pretty weak state, which also goes back to colonial times. But the main issue today has been its high economic dependence on tourism and the increased level of crime, especially of gangs. COVID has exacerbated both of these problems. The following poorest country is Bolivia. According to the World Bank, 15.2% of its people live in extreme poverty. Ironically, although not coincidentally, its poorest regions are those that were the richest during colonial times, the departments of Potosí and Chuquisaca. Part of the reason is that the mining that sustained the local economy in those days was entirely extractive, aimed almost entirely at the needs and whims of distant Spain, and the post-independence period never returned to the prosperity of colonial times, and to the extent that it did, it remained as extractive as ever. If you couple that with yet another weak state and pretty terrible economic policy, you get Bolivia today. Guatemala is next on the list with 7% of its people living in extreme poverty. The country also follows the pattern of colonial extraction, although the systematic exploitation of indigenous peoples continued long after independence. It is not a coincidence that the departments with the largest number of indigenous people are also the ones that are disproportionately poor. The more recent roots of poverty lie in the Civil War that rocked the country between 1960 and 1990. Since then, the country has had slightly better economic growth than some of its neighbors, but the state remains weak and COVID exacerbated its problems. The last three countries in the top 10 are all in South America, with Colombia, Brazil, and Ecuador rounding out the list at 5.7, 3.9, and 3.9% of their people living below their poverty line. The reasons for these are complex. In Colombia, it has a lot to do with its legacy of violence and civil wars. In Brazil, its legacy of slavery. And in Ecuador, authoritarianism and bad economic policy. The one thing they all have in common, though, are weak, unresponsive states. It's the thread that connects all the countries in this list. Meanwhile, our numbers on inequality are incomplete. We do not have good data on Venezuela or Cuba, not least because of political reasons. But it's very likely that although they are probably not number 1 or 2 of the most unequal places in Latin America, they are definitely in the top 10, if not the top 5. In both of their cases, inequality stems directly from those who have access to dollars, either via remittances, government contacts, or especially in the case of Cuba, tourism. Excluding those two countries, however, the most unequal places in Latin America as of 2019, according to the World Bank, were Brazil, Belize, Colombia, Panama, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Paraguay. These numbers, no doubt, have changed because of COVID, as some of the richest people in the continent have thrived under the pandemic, while people who were previously middle class fell into poverty, but we do not yet know the exact variation across countries. The current numbers, however, are staggering. In Brazil, for instance, the richest 1% had nearly half of the country's wealth, while in Colombia it was 40%. Meanwhile, in Belize, Guatemala, and Panama, the richest 1% received around 20% of all income. Each of these countries has specific reasons for their high level of inequality. Brazil's, for instance, goes all the way back to its slave past and its legacy of refusing to provide broad public goods to the poorest, especially education. But the one thing that all countries in Latin America have in common is that the region has had trouble having sustained economic growth, and when it has, it is rarely broadly shared. Even more so, because Latin America as a whole does a terrible job of educating its citizens, social mobility is lacking in comparison to most other regions in the world, except for sub-Saharan Africa. In a situation like that, poverty is very difficult to eradicate and inequality becomes structural. Still, Latin America did have success in diminishing its level of poverty as recently as the 2010s. There is no reason to think it cannot happen again.